The most powerful man in oil just chose Canada over America, and nobody saw it. Coming on April 29, 2026, the most powerful oil king on the planet picked up the phone. He did not call Donald Trump. He did not call any leader in Europe. Surprised. He called Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, a man who had only been in office for about a year. And they did not just say hello, they talked about a real partnership across 5 big areas: energy, food, minerals, defense, aerospace. And then the oil king personally invited Carney to come visit him in Saudi Arabia. Think about what that means for 1 second. Pause. This was Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the man who controls one of the most valuable oil supplies on earth. And out of every leader in the world, he called Canada.
Not America, not Europe, Canada. So the question is, why? Why would the most powerful man in oil turn his back on the United States and look north to Canada? And what does this mean for the rest of the world? That is exactly what we are going to break down today. Because this is not just about one phone call. This is about a massive shift in global power. And once you understand what really happened, you will never look at world news the same way again.
Let's start with what everyone thought they knew. In November 2025, Donald Trump had what looked like the biggest win of his foreign policy career. MBS came to the White House. There were military jets flying overhead. There were Arabian horses escorting the motorcade. It was a massive show. And Trump announced that Saudi Arabia had pledged almost $1 trillion in investments into the United States. 1 trillion, that's a 1 with 12 zeros behind it. Trump called it the proof that his style of doing deals worked. He said it was the beginning of a golden age for America and Saudi Arabia together. The world watched, the media covered it nonstop. It looked like a historic moment. But here's what no one told you. The numbers were not real. When MBS actually spoke in that meeting, he used very careful language. He said agreements would amount to almost 1 trillion in investment and opportunity. He did not say committed. He did not say guaranteed. He said opportunity. There is a giant difference between those two words. And then when the actual investment forum happened in Saudi Arabia a few months later, the official total of real deals signed was just over $300 billion, not 1 trillion. Not 600 billion, which is what the White House was saying. 300 billion, a third of what Trump had announced to the world. That gap between 300 billion, 600 billion, and 1 trillion is not a math mistake. That is the difference between what was actually agreed to and what was said on television for maximum applause. And that gap matters because it tells you everything about what kind of relationship Trump was actually building with Saudi Arabia. It looked strong, it felt historic, but underneath, it was already falling apart before the real crisis even started. And then February 28, 2026 happened. That was the day the Iran war began. The United States and Israel launched a military operation called Operation Epic Fury. And from that moment, everything changed for Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia was supposed to be an American partner. But nobody asked Saudi Arabia before the bombs started falling. Nobody called Riyadh. Nobody said, "We are about to start a war in your backyard. What do you think?" They just did it. And then the Iranian response came. On April 2026, Iranian missiles hit Saudi Arabia directly. They struck the Ras Tanura refinery. They hit the Karais oil facility. They damaged the Manifa production fields. And most critically, they hit the Petroline pipeline, the main route that moves Saudi oil from the oil fields in the east to the Red Sea in the west. In one coordinated strike, Saudi Arabia lost 600,000 barrels of oil per day. 600,000 Saudi Arabia's oil is its everything. It is the foundation of their entire future plan called Vision, 2030. And it was getting destroyed by missiles in a war. They never agreed to join. Before this war started, Saudi Arabia had actually been doing the opposite. MBS had been playing the role of the great peacemaker. Saudi Arabia helped broker a deal between Iran and China back in 2023. They were hosting peace talks about Ukraine. They were pushing the Trump administration to do nuclear talks with Iran and avoid a conflict. They wanted diplomacy, not bombs. None of that mattered on February 18. Now, stay with me here, because this is where it gets really important. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Because what I am about to show you is the kind of analysis you are not going to find anywhere else. Here is what happened inside the US-Saudi relationship during the war. According to reporting from the Financial Times in April, 2026, Saudi officials were openly angry at how Trump was handling things. Senior Saudi leaders felt their concerns were being completely ignored. And then Trump made it even worse. On March 23 RD, Trump made a public statement suggesting that the Strait of Hormuz might one day be jointly controlled by the United States and Iran. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that almost all of Saudi Arabia's oil exports pass through. Trump was talking about handing joint control of that to Iran, the country that was literally firing missiles at Saudi oil fields. Saudi Arabia did not respond publicly, but analysts in Paris at the Foundation for Strategic Research said this moment would leave a lasting mark on the relationship between America and Saudi Arabia. And then separately, Trump made personal insulting comments about MBS himself. Again, Saudi Arabia stayed quiet publicly. But in the world of diplomacy, silence is not forgiveness. Silence is calculation. And MBS was calculating. So why Canada? Why did MBS reach out to a country that most Americans can barely find on a map when it comes to global power politics? Because Canada had been quietly doing the work for over a year. Back in January 2026, Canada sent a group of government ministers to a minerals forum in Saudi Arabia. On January 2nd, Canada signed a formal agreement with Saudi Arabia's Minister of Industry on critical minerals cooperation. Real cooperation, not a photo opportunity. A legal document covering trade, investment, supply chains, and knowledge sharing. And then a Canadian company called Northern Graphite partnered with a Saudi investment group to build a battery material processing facility inside Saudi Arabia. That is actual industrial infrastructure being built between the two countries. This relationship had real money behind it too. In 2024, Saudi Arabia was already Canada's biggest trading partner across the entire Middle East and North Africa region. The two countries were doing over $4 billion in trade every single year. Canada was selling Saudi Arabia defense products aircraft, vehicles, medicine, and machinery. This was not a new idea. This was a foundation. And Carney was building something on top of it. Carney was building something on top of it. Here is why this matters so much. Right now, Saudi Arabia has Vision 2030. It is their national plan to stop depending on oil money and become a modern economy. To do that, they need critical minerals. Things like rare earths, lithium, graphite, materials used in batteries, electronics, defense systems, and green energy technology. Saudi Arabia actually sits on some of the most valuable rare earth deposits on Earth. Their Jabal Said reserve has over 500,000 tons of heavy rare earths alone. But having minerals in the ground is not the same as having a supply chain. You need expertise. You need technology. You need partners who know how to actually pull those materials out and process them. Canada has all of that. And Canada needed Saudi Arabia just as much. Here is why. Carney had promised Canadians he would double exports to countries outside the United States by 2030. That promise sounds simple until you realize that almost 60% of all Canadian exports in 2030were still going to the United States. And with Trump's trade war putting heavy tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada was getting hurt. Jobs were being lost. Investment was leaving. Carney needed new markets desperately. So Canada started moving fast in his first year as Prime Minister. Carney made reshaped trips to foreign countries. He spent reshaped days outside Canada in 365 days. He signed a big trade deal with Indonesia. He signed an investment protection deal with the UAE. He started trade talks with Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, Thailand, and others. And he kept saying the same thing everywhere he went. Canada wants to be an energy superpower. That phrase meant a lot during a war that was shutting down Gulf oil. The Strait of Hormuz was functionally closed to Western ships for weeks. During the Iran conflict that Qatar declared force majeure on its gas contracts, meaning it could not deliver what it had promised. European natural gas prices jumped more than 50% in just 68 hours. The International Energy Agency released 8 million barrels from emergency reserves just to try to slow down the price spike. Oil was climbing past $100 a barrel and heading higher. Every country that imports energy from the Gulf was suddenly looking around, asking, is there someone else who can supply us? Someone stable, someone safe. Canada was sitting right there with massive oil and gas reserves, LNG export potential, and a government that was not at war with anyone. Now, here is something Saudi Arabia also noticed that Washington never did. Canada had refused to join the war. On March 3rd, 2026, Carney was visiting Australia when he publicly called the Iran war a failure of the international order. He said the United States had not consulted its allies before striking. Canada stated clearly it would not participate in the offensive. And polls showed that 68% of Canadians opposed the war. For MBS, this mattered enormously. Saudi Arabia had been urging restraint and diplomacy the whole time. Canada's public position aligned almost perfectly with what Saudi Arabia had been saying. Canada was a NATO member, a G-Chut economy, a serious Western country, and yet it had kept its distance from a war that was destroying Saudi oil infrastructure and creating chaos across the Gulf. That combination, a stable Western partner with resources, with expertise, with no interest in the war, who was actively seeking a new relationship, was exactly what Saudi Arabia needed. So when MBS picked up the phone on April 29 and called Carney, this is what he was doing. He was choosing substance over spectacle. He was choosing a real relationship built on real needs over a flashy deal, full of numbers that looked great on television but did not hold up to scrutiny. The readout from Carney's office was very careful and professional. Carney condemned the Iranian missile strikes on Saudi Arabia. He thanked MBS for urging restraint throughout the conflict. He acknowledged the more than sampic Canadians that Saudi Arabia had personally helped evacuate from conflict zones. And then the two men moved straight into the economic partnership, 5 sectors: food critical minerals, defense aerospace, and a personal invitation to visit Riyadh. Now let's talk about what Trump actually got versus what Canada is building, because the contrast is striking. Trump got a number, almost $1 trillion. It made headlines around the world. It dominated cable news for weeks, and then it quietly fell apart. The actual signed deals total about $300 billion. Much of the rest was described as opportunities, not commitments. No timeline was given. And the relationship that was supposed to be the proof of Trump's deal-making genius ended up strained by a war, insulted by public comments, and ignored by Saudi Arabia when it came to the most important strategic decisions. Of Canada got something different. Canada got no headline number, no cavalry escorts, no military flyovers. Canada got a 5-sector framework built on over $1 billion in real existing trade, a signed minerals agreement, an actual industrial partnership on the ground. Inside Saudi Arabia, a personal phone call from MBS and an invitation to Riyadh. Which one of those outcomes is actually worth more? This is why you need to subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because we are tracking the real shifts in global power, not just the ones that get the loudest headlines. The world is reorganizing, and the countries that are going to win the next decade are the ones building real relationships, while everyone else is focused on the show. What comes next is the key question. When Carney travels to Saudi Arabia, and he will go, the 5-sector framework will become detailed real agreements. Canada has pledged to help catalyze $1 billion in new private sector investment. A major Saudi sovereign wealth fund commitment to Canadian minerals. Energy or aerospace infrastructure would fit directly into that plan. For Saudi Arabia, locking in a stable, long-term supply chain partner in a NATO country that is not dragging them into wars is worth far more than a spectacular promise that dissolves when the politics shift. The $1 trillion deal Trump announced with Saudi Arabia will be remembered mostly for the gap between what was said and what was real. The deal Carney is building will be remembered for something quieter and far more durable. A shared understanding of what both sides actually need. Canada needs capital, new markets, and investment. Saudi Arabia needs trusted partners, reliable supply chains, and relationships that come without public humiliation and diplomatic chaos attached.
That phone call on April 29th was not a courtesy. It was a calculation. and the calculation pointed north. Here's my question for you. Watching all of this unfold, do you think Canada can actually become the kind of global energy and minerals superpower that Carney is promising? Or is this a moment that will fade once the Gulf crisis calms down and old relationships reset? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one.